Okay, it's my great pleasure now to reintroduce our patron Brian Cooke, to give us the Greg Mutsey oration. Now, a little bit of background in term for Brian. He's a graduate of the University of Melbourne. That's him. He came to South Australia, so we were very fortunate that he came across here to work for, what was the name of the organisation, whatever the government department was at that time?
It was called the Vermin Control Branch of the Lands Department.
The Vermin Control Branch, a very notable name. So Brian came and worked on that for quite a period of time. He had some overseas stints associated with that. He received funding from organisations like it's called the Meat Research at one stage. Now it's the equivalent of I guess its current form is the Meat and Livestock Association. Their association? I guess they are. Australia. Meat and Livestock Australia. And also the Australian Wool Industry Funds. And during that time he worked on rabbit fleet, the reintroduction of rabbit fleet for the promotion of and transfer of mixo. Is that correct, Brian? Yes. And then you had a period with CSIRO. I thought he was in there for a longer period of time. It was only 7 or 8 years, Brian. And he had periods of overseas work, including Ecuador. And I know there were some samples that came up in Amy's collection of the blood samples that came from various islands in the Pacific.
Well, yeah, sub-Antarctic.
And sub-Antarctic islands. And you actually collected those, Brian?
Yes.
There we go. So he's had an illustrious time. I first learned about Brian when he was on Australia All Over with Ian McNamara on a number of occasions. I was over in Griffith at the time. And I thought, well, there's a bloke who actually knows what he's talking about, contrary to some of those that Mackie gets on. And so I was always looking forward to meeting Brian, because he was always a font of knowledge and came across as being well informed and taking a very considered and scientific approach to the management of rabbits. And is currently being asked to potentially edit an international journal on having a look at RHDV2, which is now endemic within the Australian rabbit population, and seeing what sort of influence it's also having on other largemorphs, so that's hares and rabbits of various kinds around the world. So that's the kind of standing that Brian has amongst world science leaders. So it's now my pleasant duty to ask you to come and give us the Greg Mutsey oration, which is called the Illustrious History of Rabbit Biocontrol. Brian.
Thanks, Wayne. It's good to see everyone here, and it is wonderful, I suppose, in some ways, to be presenting an oration in respect to Greg Mutsey and his passing, because he was a very important person in Australian rabbit control history, not so much for actually directly controlling rabbits, although he did a fair bit of that too, but his main contribution was the work he did looking at the impact of rabbits on natural vegetation. That was an area that was lacking, and Greg did a lot of work in that respect. Start out and give some background history on people's attitudes to rabbits, and why rabbits became a problem, I guess, in Australia, and how quickly that attitude to rabbits, which was initially favourable, got turned around completely. Because this is one of the really interesting things in scientific history, if you like. It all began with Henry VIII. During his reign, the new Parliament at the time passed regulations and laws regarding the control of crows and rooks. And villages of more than 10 houses were obliged to to set nets to catch these birds because they were regarded as unwanted pests. Under his daughter, Elizabeth I, it became even more extreme, and people in villages had to control bullfinches, which ate all the buds off cherry trees and apple trees and the likes when they migrated into England. And boys were paid a penny a dozen for sparrow eggs, because sparrows were regarded as eating corn and stealing thatch from cottages. And this was done by church wardens, and they obtained the money for these bounties from wealthy landholders. Oddly enough, even kingfishers were regarded as needing control because they were enemies of fish. They were thought to eat fish eggs and fry. And of course, stoats and weasels and hedgehogs were just useless vermin. And the hedgehogs were said to steal milk from sleeping and recumbent cows, cows that were lying down, in other words. These laws became widespread in Britain in particular, and interestingly enough, these laws to control pest animals didn't include things like foxes and rabbits, and the foxes and rabbits were always up to the privileged classes in Britain to control. They weren't for the ordinary people. And people, when they first came into Australia, felt that they had to surround themselves with plants and animals that they were familiar with. And in South Australia, when rabbits were first introduced, they were actually protected. They had an open season, but they also had a closed season when the rabbits could breed up. And this whole attitude towards wildlife was rather terrible in a way, because you could be fined £10 for killing a deer, but at the same time all marsupials were regarded as useless and unprotected. All marsupials, the legislation said. And vermin districts were set up in many, many parts of South Australia, and the numbers, if they're true, are quite horrifying. Vermin District 31 in the Flinders Ranges, which was around the Hawker area, within 3 months of the year, they paid out over 13,000 bounties on dingoes, over 500 on eagles, 35,000 on kangaroos, and 110,000 for wallabies. And you're talking about quite a high, I can't remember the exact amount of money, but it was a couple of shillings a head for some of these. And they killed over 50,000 rabbits in that period, and the rabbits were getting a penny a scalp. But the impact on Aboriginal people at the time was enormous, because these people were basically killing the game that the Aboriginal people needed. The attitudes could be summed up in the following press item. I'll leave you to read that, but basically people were using information that Charles Darwin had developed about, the survival of the fittest and things, and they were using that to say that their attitude to life, their attitude to colonising the place was because they were the fitter group. And likewise, they saw the animals from Europe as being much fitter than the fit for purpose as well as the much more so than the native mammals. To give you an example of how ridiculous things became, in parliamentary debate the Honourable J.L. Sterling said that he had the assurance of several persons that during a season of 2 years ago, when water was scarce in the interior, these birds consumed grass that would have maintained 2,000 sheep. This is 2 years previously, and the assurance of several people. And the Tooris, or the black-tailed native hen, were duly declared vermin. But at the time there were 7 million sheep in Australia when Sterling made his comments. So the amount of pasture that the birds ate in a brief period 2 years earlier amounted to about 0.03% of what the sheep were eating. But that was enough to rank them as unprotected pests. One parliamentarian announced the name, mispronounced the name of the birds as Tories, and all the other parliamentarians said, well, Tories should be unprotected anyway, shouldn't they? so that was the level of the debate that was going on at the time for people to decide whether or not animals should be regarded as vermin and bounties paid out on them. But what interests me more, given that sort of history, is the how quickly, in relative terms, that attitude has changed around, and we were able to develop much sterner attitudes towards pest animals like rabbits. And what I want to talk about briefly is just how some of the ways in which that was turned around, and by some of the people who turned it around. For a start, not everyone agreed that with those attitudes. There were people in society who objected very strongly to people bringing in pest animals, acclimatisation societies bringing animals willy-nilly, and Mr. Mather from the Royal Society of Tasmania wrote to the Tasmanian Minister of Lands expressing the need to put aside some land for actually conserving native mammals and native vegetation, and rather than just having this continuous pressure on our wildlife and vegetation, where all sorts of animals were being brought in from deer and the likes. And he pointed out that now that the ministry in Tasmania was composed of Tasmanian-born Britishers, rather than people who'd been educated in England, it would be an opportune time to actually start some sort of conservation movement. That didn't happen immediately, but obviously there was that undercurrent prior to, or around about the time of federation that started the ball rolling. Here I'd like to argue that many of the scientists and administrators who were born at about that time were the ones who developed this more objective way of looking at the rabbit population and introduced animals, and they I think were very influential in their own way in starting to turn public attitudes around. And the list includes Macfarlane Burnett and Lionel Bull, Ian Clunies-Ross, and Dame Jim McNamara, as well as Francis Radcliffe from CSIRO, and overseas people as well. This change in attitude wasn't just restricted to Australia, of course, it was happening in Britain simultaneously. Frank Macfarlane Burnett was a Nobel laureate because of his interest. He made enormous contributions to the understanding of the body's immune system. I don't know if you know that he was the person who put the idea that body cells recognise self and non-self, and that became that whole understanding of how the body develops immunity. He was also very interested in Australia's natural fauna, and he had, when he was at Geelong College, which Bruce might like might know about anyway, but he had this enormous collection of Australian beetles and things like that, which was a lifelong interest in his, apart from the fact that he was also the director of a major medical institute. And it was this sort of interest in Australian fauna and flora, and that helped to change attitudes. And of course, Macfarlane Burnett also was the first person to recognise that if we introduced myxomatosis, we would have an experimental situation where we could actually study how a disease getting into a new animal population evolved with that animal population. Lionel Bull did quite a lot of work on the early experiments with myxomatosis to see whether it was going to be a good biological control agent. He was a rather formidable character, apparently, and often in dispute with some of his fellow administrators, but he certainly made a fairly early contribution to that field. Perhaps more interesting is Macfarlane Burnett's protege, who was Frank Fenner. Fenner and Burnett wrote a book about the immune system just after Fenner came back from war services, and they obviously had a very big interest in myxomatosis as it was being introduced in the early 50s. And when the opportunity came, Frank Fenner seized it with both hands and began to understand, do all the research that was necessary to measure how rabbits were evolving resistance, and the virus at first attenuated to become a moderated virus, and then began increasing its virulence again in step with the rabbit population's increasing resistance. And of course, Frank went on to found the Centre for Resource Environmental Studies, the ANU, indicating his broad interest in Australian conservation and the likes. And he was, of course, a former patron of Rabbit Free Australia. One of the characters, I suppose, that I came across in doing some of this research was an important British scientist called J.B.S. Haldane. And after Darwin, Charles Darwin introduced his theory of evolution, and as I said before, people used that to their own advantage, saying, you know, the survival of the fittest is the key thing. But what Haldane did was look at what the implications of this would be in terms of long-term evolution, and he, along with several of the other key players like Ernst Mayr and Theodosius Dobzhansky and Julian Huxley, they actually put together what we know today as the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology. They brought in Darwin's ideas, but married them up with gene theory and the likes. He was quite a character, and he did a lot of work during the Second World War, looking at how people might escape from submarines that were sunk without suffering unduly from depressurisation and things like that. One of his students was Jimmy Rendell, and prior to, he was a PhD student studying mathematics of genetics with Haldane, and then he he went into the Naval Reserve in Britain during the war and took part in experiments with Haldane, helping to find how people could withstand depressurisation. In fact, because these people actually did experiments of their own and on themselves, Rendell was very badly injured and suffered very badly from lung damage in later life. But he migrated to Australia and became chief of the former CSIRO Division of Genetics, and in his own way contributed enormously to our knowledge of rabbit resistance and myxovirus virulence. In some ways, his work was turning out to be more important than some of Frank Fenner's data, although we've been recently using this his approach to studying virus genetics to reanalyse some of Frank Fenner's work. Dame Miriam Rothschild was interesting because her father was a British banker, and he had a hobby collecting all sorts of things, but also collecting fleas. And his daughter took after him in that sense, and she did quite a lot of work on elucidating the way in which fleas need rabbit hormones to complete their own life cycle. And along with Mead Briggs in Britain, she contributed enormously, and her knowledge was subsequently used by W.R. Sobey, who Rendell recruited to evaluate the inheritance of resistance of myxomatosis in rabbits. And Sobey, using Rothschild's information, was able to successfully import European rabbit fleas, which we know were very, very useful in helping to spread myxomatosis in Australia. Another person who indirectly influenced Australian work on myxomatosis was Charles Elton. He was an Oxford scholar. He worked on rabbit biology before World War II, and then on the control of rats and mice in Britain during the war. And he began thinking about the ecology of invasive species, and his ideas were and how bad they were in most instances where new species were introduced to new countries. And his ideas were a total reversal of the ideas that had grown up in Britain over previous centuries, where anything that was not useful was eliminated. And he was perhaps one of the first people who started to consolidate that idea that we should be maintaining natural fauna and flora. Ian Clunies-Ross was a very, very interesting character. He was the chairman of CSIR at the time, CSIR became, and very much a hands-on administrator. He enabled Francis Ratcliffe, who worked on the introduction of myxovirus to Australia, to spend 12 months in Oxford so that with Elton, so he could actually understand what Elton was getting at in his ideas on preservation of wildlife and native mammals and the exclusion of introduced pests. And it was Clunies-Ross that also conceived the idea that when Murray Valley encephalitis broke out and everyone said, oh, myxo is getting into the human population, he was the one that suggested that he and McFarlane, Burnett and Fenner should inoculate themselves with myxovirus to prove that it wasn't going to be it wasn't actually going to spread into the human population. It was said of Ian Clunies-Ross that he was a very humorous speaker, and it needed nothing more than the stimulation of a cup of tea to have him miming the actions of a sumo wrestler or a malleefowl piercing its nest during his lectures. Depending on what it was, he was able to sort of mime these things, and he was really a very able administrator in that sense, that he always had a convincing argument for people. And of course, Francis Radcliffe, as an undergraduate, Radcliffe was lectured at Oxford University by Julian Huxley, who was regarded as one of Darwin's bulldogs, if you like, in the sense that he was a strong advocate of Darwin's ideas, but also moving on into a modern synthesis of evolution. And he did a lot of work in Australia on flying foxes, and drifting sand was the name of his book, because he worked on soil erosion in South Australia. And as I said, he spent a year in Oxford with Elton to get sort of a good feel of what was going on with conservation issues. You often think to yourself that you're a long way away from some of these people, but when I was looking at my own history in this area, one of Elton's PhD students was at Oxford was Michael Smythe, who was a Rhodes Scholar from Adelaide University. On return to Australia, Michael was my MSc student, my MSc supervisor, sorry, and subsequently PhD supervisor before his untimely death due to cancer in 1993. And so the thing that's coming out of all these different lines of evidence, I guess, is what a tight network it was in many ways, and how all these people are interrelated just by, just one degree apart, if you like. Dame Jean McNamara was well known for her work on rehabilitating children with infantile paralysis. Because she was so interested in viruses in general, she went and visited various research institutes in the USA in particular, and when she came back to Australia, she was very, very critical of CSIRO's efforts to test myxoma virus as a biological control agent, and she eventually won the fight in the sense that the CSIRO had been testing the virus out in dry parts of South Australia, and she said, look, we must actually move your experiments into wetter parts of New South Wales, and sure enough, that was when the myxoma started to spread. One of her, the people who influenced her was Richard Shope. There's a virus called Shope's fibroma, which is known to many of the people here, I suppose. But Shope greatly influenced Jean McNamara's idea that myxoma virus could be a useful biological control agent. Degrees of separation again. Would you know it? Dame Jean McNamara was in the same final year class of medicine at Melbourne University as McFarlane Burnett. So you've got this continuing interaction between people in terms of their knowledge and the way they're sharing ideas. Just to finish up, I'd like to mention that another important person in Australian rabbit biological control was Peter Kerr, who died earlier this year, and Peter made important contributions to the understanding of rabbit resistance to myxomatosis. Again, to bring in a local connection, Sonia Best, who was the daughter of Lindsay Best, who worked in the South Australian National Parks and Wildlife Service, worked closely with Peter in the field. And of course, administrators play an important role, as Nicholas Newland would fully understand that Lindsay Best played a key role in the introduction of rabbit calicivirus, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus into Australia. Lindsay and I went to a meeting in New Zealand where we had to convince the politicians that it was actually worth putting a lot of money into doing the basic research needed to introduce rabbit hemorrhagic disease into Australia. In summary, I think this presentation just presents just a little glimpse into the past to show how scientists and medical practitioners and administrators from different countries exchanged ideas and shaped Australia's present attitudes to rabbit control and conservation. They're not independent issues, and I certainly haven't mentioned everyone by a long way, and it's written here. I didn't mention the Italian Giuseppe Cinerelli, who first discovered the named the myxoma virus, nor the Brazilian Enrique Aragon, who first suggested it might be used to control rabbits in Australia. Nevertheless, that's an important and fascinating aspect of history of science from which people like Greg continue to build.
Nicholas and then...
I'd just like to make the point that Brian Cooke is one of those people that he did mention.
I'd like to ask, where is the network spreading from you, Brian? It's spread to Greg, but where else?
Well, we've got a number of people around the place who are younger scientists who haven't quite got the intensity of work just on rabbits, but certainly that interest in rabbits. There's Pat and Canada and others, and Graham over here, who is obviously interested in how do we handle the rabbit population from an economic point of view or ecological point of view. So it is something I've tried hard to work on, actually, because I think it's terribly, terribly important that if we can bring along other people to on that same journey, because it's something we've invested so much in, we can't just drop it. And today we were talking about the idea that it's 30 years since the last trials were done to test the resistance of rabbits to myxomatosis, and where is rabbit resistance today, and what should we do about it? And if you look at myxomatosis as a biological asset or an ecological service, which it is, the fact that we haven't looked at how well it's going for the last 30 years is really an indictment on us, because if you had assets like your home, you actually put some effort into insurance or something to make sure that things are running. You keep up its maintenance and the likes. But with myxomatosis, we seem to have dropped the ball a bit, and we should be looking at the changes in resistance of rabbits to myxomatosis and of course RHD as well, to see just what's going on. And some of that work would be fairly straightforward, I think, and I think it should be it should be something that's done just to make sure that we're on the ball. You know, if rabbits are slowly outstripping the virulence of their genetic resistance is outstripping the virulence of myxomovirus and RHD, we should know about that, and we should actually be in a position to try and do something about it. We shouldn't just watch it happen.
Yeah, David.
So Brian, I can say the Candup is keen to do that. We've got him a sample coming out from the Flinders when we can get it. And a vet at Mount Gambier, Rebel, has provided us mixo samples for over 15 years, and he's going to send some more up. So Candup may somewhat carry Peter's baton into the future as an epidemiologist. It was Edward Sterling, from who had land at Perth in Port Augusta. Was Sterling you're talking about in here?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And also released rabbits quite extensively.
Yeah, he was Australian born, but he went to Britain and did law at Oxford. But he was admitted into the Inner Temple legally, but I don't think he ever practiced in Britain. And he came back to Australia and became a parliamentarian. But his initials were JL, so I don't know if it's the.
Yeah, not sure.
I think he was known as Lancelot Sterling. He was the brother of E.C. Sterling.
Okay.
And he was my great uncle.
Right.
And E.C. Sterling was my great grandfather.
Well, there's not too many degrees of separation there, is there?
E.C. helped establish, he founded the museum and helped establish Flinders. So they probably had some family arguments about this.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, little bit of information to find out who he was and how he's related to someone.
Be careful what you talk about, don't you? All right, then last question to Brian.
Really, just a comment really, when we had Frank Fenner to lunch many years ago, and I was interested in this injecting themselves story, and I said, is it true that you and McFarlane Burnett injected yourselves with Mixo? And I thought I'd destroyed a myth. He said, no. Then he added, I injected McFarlane Burnett and he injected me. That was true.
Yeah, I had a funny story from Frank on a similar line that he obviously injected the other two, and then when it came to taking a blood sample to test whether they'd formed antibodies, Frank was quite nervous, and apparently McFarlane Burnett always dressed very nicely in a suit and things like that. And Frank had this old Luolock syringe, you know, the glass syringe, and the needle sort of just latched onto the outside with this funny little lock. And then anyway, as he was drawing the blood sample, the syringe came apart from the needle, and a lot of the blood went all over McFarlane Burnett's suit. and Frank was more concerned about that than whether he had
Right, just last question for Bruce.
Brian, I'm glad that you're going more than lip service to Jean McNamara, because I think history has not done her a great deal of service. Her contribution was huge, as you indicated, and also she was working at a time when this was not really her field, it was an incidental interest of hers. She was a woman scientist, of whom there were very, very few in those days, and the few who were there were not really taken very seriously. But she stuck to her guns, and she was a bit of a stirrer, which got on the nose of some of the admin. So there's a real story just in Jean, so I'm glad you didn't pass too lightly over it.
Yeah, Francis Radcliffe said he was so sort of demolished by her attacks and things like that, that he said that Dame Jean thinks I'm a boil on the bum of progress.
She wouldn't use those words.
Right.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that as you're looking into the history of some of these leaders and the comments by other people, there's a lot of humour in what people did. You know, they little anecdotes about their behaviour or their attitudes and things like that, which makes science alive.
Great, thanks, Brian. Now, Ron, come forward and
Don't go away.
yeah, don't go away. Over to you, Ron, for further next.
Well, what a privilege we all have just had hearing that story from Brian. I mean, every time you hear him speak, you learn lots and lots and lots. What a fantastic resource. You are a national, what's the word, a national treasure, without a doubt. And I have to point out, following on from what you were saying about what we need to be doing in the future, is that, you know, the South Australian government has been, you know, over the years has put in a huge amount into rabbit research, and today there's not one person here from that organisation. I think that's a disgrace. But I think on behalf of everybody here, thank you. It was a privilege. I hope you enjoyed a little drop of South Australia, and thank you for the talk. It was great.